So thanks to this event, which is a book launch, two CU colleagues recently published important new manuscripts, new books on a common theme, gender and democracy, and we thought that the DI conference on probing democracy would be an ideal context and platform to discuss these two new publications. And what better way to do so than by hearing directly from the authors, right? It's a pity that there can't be a signing session. Maybe Eva, you're selling your books and you will sign them after the event. But with Andrea and Conny, that won't work because they're joining us from Amsterdam.
Yeah.
I'm in Vienna, and as you can see the background, I recently moved from Budapest to Vienna. Moved with the Central European University, and Eva is holding the fort back in Budapest. So we had a preparatory meeting. We came up with a script, and we also clarified my role. And my role is, as I said, I throw balls in the air, and then Andrea, Eva, and Conny, they play tennis with it. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, which after reading their works, questions that came to my mind, and I think also questions that have a broader relevance. And then most of the talking will fortunately be done by the authors themselves, who will start with introducing their book and talking a bit about what motivated them to research their particular themes and then to write these works. So Andrea and Conny, they published with Bogaards Macmillan a book on politicizing gender and democracy in the context of the Istanbul Convention, and Eva also with Bogaards Macmillan published The Gender Regime of Anti-Liberal Hungary. I don't know who wants to start, but yeah, a bit about yourself, and then yeah, how did you get to work on this book? What motivated you? What drove you?
So maybe Eva, you want to start?
I was taught to always start with the online people, but I can start. Thank you. So thank you for being here, and thank you to my colleagues, fellow authors, and also Matthijs for agreeing to participate in this panel. So about my book, it is a short book. It's a pivot, and it's going to be open access. It's not published yet, but it'll be available to anybody who wants to read it. I started writing it in 2013, or conceiving it and writing it in 2013, 2014. And I was going to write a book about work, gender and work, and specifically about foster parenting, because it's such a gendered kind of work. And also the concept of care work is important in the sociology of gender. So I wanted to explore what kind of work is fostering paid parenting and how that fits into sort of the larger scheme of the gender inequalities in the workplace and at work. But then, as I was researching the book, regulations about fostering changed radically. And as I was writing the book, it kept changing and it wouldn't stop. So the book started moving from being about work and the actual work that people do and the meaning that they attribute to that work, from there to a book about social policies and how the state regulates childcare and social support. And not just childcare, but also social citizenship. So in the end, the book is about changes in social citizenship rights, in the logic and principles of social citizenship under an anti-liberal regime. That's what the book and how sort of gender is important in that process. How talk about gender, so how the concept is used to legitimate and to construct a new form of social citizenship, and how that new construction creates new forms of gender inequalities and in access to resources in the workplace, in social life. That is what the book is about. So there's so in some ways I was deeply influenced by the political changes that were happening at the time, and I was writing. Every time I went back to the manuscript, I had to rethink because there was a somewhat new context out there. But there's still a bit about fostering, and most of the stuff is about social changes in the logic of social citizenship rights. So I'll just stop here and pass the floor on to Andrea and Conny.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for organizing and for being so patient to be with us in different locations, like in 3 different locations. So I hope this is enjoyable this way and it's not too embarrassing for Eva. So just a little bit about our book, and I start and then the way we will go, because we are sitting here together with Conny. The way we will go, we will each take one question and then the other one will complement, so we don't want to talk everywhere, or both of us. So just a little bit on my side about the book. So it started way before this book. It started with a previous book, actually, when we were writing a comparative analysis of 5 countries of Central and Eastern Europe and their development of domestic violence policy regimes. And the research went on and on for quite a long time, and it was a very progressive story for the most part, and we were interested to see how women's movements influenced the policy making, and despite all the narrative that there is not very powerful women's movements in this region, that there is not a lot of gender progress and so on. So our story was one of progress. But what was interesting that by the time we finished, and the book was published in 2018, 3, maybe 4 of our 5 stories turned to be not so progressive anymore. So it looked like, oh, okay, so something is really changing, and maybe we are publishing this now, but maybe it's not the right narrative to publish anymore. It is not the right way to come to this. So we ended that book nevertheless, and we then turned to see what's going on, why things are changing, why backsliding has started, what was the dynamics around backsliding. And so this is how we ended up looking at one of the most prominent elements of change, or the document that occasioned most debates and most backsliding in these countries in the field of violence against women, and that's the Istanbul Convention. So our book is basically about looking at the political debates around the Istanbul Convention and trying to understand how these debates have changed the policy field of violence against women, but also how these debates have impacted women's rights organizations and women's rights activism, because it is not just the policy field that changes, but we also see quite some changes in terms of how mobilization is possible these days, and what's the role of women's rights organizations in this mobilization process and how they change. So that's in a nutshell, the book. We're comparing 4 countries. We compare Bulgaria, Croatia, and Hungary, Poland. So these are our 4 cases, and all of them had major debates around the Istanbul Convention. And so basically the book is first looking at the attacks. This is the book. It has been published just like 3 weeks ago, so a bit ahead of time, which is really great news. We are looking first at the attacks, and then we look at the consequences for mobilization and for policies and democracy more widely. So that's
maybe to quickly add, like Eva, we wanted to write a pivot, but then we really got fascinated by the story, and it's a really very complex story. And so this is actually why it turned out to become a whole book and took somewhat longer, because it's such a fascinating story and lens to look at current process in the region, and particularly democratic crisis as well.
Yeah, we have to talk a bit later about how gender issues are related to political change, because that's a big theme, a central theme, basically. But maybe I'm naive, but policies to counter violence against women, how can they be controversial? This is something everybody agrees on, right? So what is controversial?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and that's actually part of our puzzle as well. So what's interesting about violence against women is that it has always, so if you look at the various gender equality areas or policy fields, then this has been one of the most successful ones, and it is not just the case for the region, but it is the case globally. It's a field which is more compatible with mainstream policy thinking. It fits very nicely with crime policies and so on. So it is a field which can progress generally easier than other gender equality fields. And that was the case also in the region. Violence has also been one of the core issues of women's movements in the region, and it is still so one of the most important and most advocated fields. So we see progress in the region despite the fact that EU has never pursued violence against women policies. So this is not a development that has to do with Europeanization, but is somewhat of a parallel story. So in this sense, the Istanbul Convention and its ratification was expected to be a landslide victory. And because all these countries had policies in place already and had shelters in place, not very good ones. There were a lot of issues around implementation, everything, but there was a lot of stuff in place. So it wasn't anything brand new that this convention, it looked like nothing new was introduced by the convention. So in this context, the debates that erupted were kind of a surprise to everybody. So what we do in the book is basically try to disentangle why this could happen, and actually our previous book helps a lot because we could see how violence against women was discussed before, and what was the nature of progress really, and the nature of political debates around violence against women. So what we find basically is, or what we found is, what's interesting is that violence against women, and mainly domestic violence policies, but also some other forms, has always been discussed in the region in terms of more general human rights, in terms of crime, but policies that were adopted and laws have never engaged directly with gender equality. So they never linked violence against women to gender equality. They rather addressed the symptoms, but not the root problem. And so what the convention does, and that's the really interesting thing, and that's what makes it so political, is to make this link very explicit. So if you look back at debates before the Istanbul Convention debates in all of these countries, you will see that they managed to discuss violence against women without ever even mentioning women. So we talk about these issues without pointing to the major social problem that is behind them. And then comes the convention, which makes this link absolutely explicit and unquestionable, and says, well, if you want to engage with violence against women, you just need to engage with the inequality project at stake, and you need to introduce changes in curricula, you need to raise awareness of bureaucrats and so on. And this is what is really problematized here. So if you look at the debates, you will see that most of the political actors who speak will not say that it's okay to beat women. They're not saying that. They say, well, that's not okay. We need to protect women, but we should not be doing this in the name of gender inequality. So we don't do the transformation. We protect our women, and I think we have to put in capitals the protect word. So it is, we protect them, but we do not want them equal. So that's basically the underlying narrative. And that's really, and in a way, it was also for us, it was also the surprise element, and it was the curiosity element, because all of a sudden, after so many years of looking at these countries, we could see how we are now really talking about the issue. We're talking about gender inequality. We're talking about women. For the first time in these countries, you have ministers saying, oh, we have to protect women from violence. That has not happened before. So in a way, it looks like as if it would be better, but is it better? And so that was the book about, basically.
Thanks. That answer clarified a lot for me. Also, you brought up the theme of gender inequality, and one thing that stands out in Eva's book is this claim that in Hungary in the past 10 years, gender inequality has increased, which to some may come as a surprise because on the surface, yeah, everything is fine. There are now more women in high-profile positions than ever before. So, Eva, what research did you do to back up this claim about increasing gender inequality in the land of Orban?
Thank you, Matthijs. So my book is also about gender inequality, and in that regard, it's closely connected to what Andrea and Conny are describing in theirs, because I also, the main argument of the book is that gender inequalities are growing in Hungary, but that's not completely accidental. It's not just, that we forget about making sure that women have equal pay or equal rights as men, but gender inequality is in fact built into the new policies that the government is producing, and particularly in the specific context. So the policies in this specific context are bound to create more gender inequalities, and this is part of the way in which this is sort of one of the backbones of the political rule. So not only, of course, inequalities are a problem in and of itself, but these inequalities are constructed in a way that strengthen this anti-liberal, anti-democratic rule, provided with legitimacy. These claims about gender create political legitimacy, sort of strengthen electoral victories potentially, etc. So to be a bit more specific, to just give you an example. So, and to show what kind of inequalities I am writing about. So in the past 10 years, as many of you know, the government has passed a whole slew of pro-natalist policies encouraging birth. And indeed, the number of births have been going up with some fluctuation due to COVID, but it is increasing. And the total fertility rate in 2020 is higher than it's been since the mid-1990s. So there's some impact of those policies. That means that there are more children are born. Now, if there are more children born, that actually means more work for women. And I'm saying that because, of course, this would be more work for families, but most of childcare in a family is done by women. And whatever statistics exist, which are actually quite meager at this point on time use, show that the more children, the larger proportion of the whole work go to women. So arguably, pro-natalist policies increase women's reproductive burden. Now, they do so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the government policies are such, and these pro-natalist policies are such, that they also simultaneously push women into the labor market. And indeed, in the past 10 years, women's labor force participation has increased by about 30%, like hugely. Like there's been a huge increase. I take back the 30%, but there's been a huge increase in women's labor force participation. So while women are participating in paid work, they're also taking care of an increasing number of children. And this is in a context where, yet another twist in social policies, the government simultaneously got rid of all of the institutions that monitor or ensure gender inequalities, for example, in the workplace. And the state ministers can claim that their ministries are not family-friendly workplaces. And, they say this in public in a way to show that this is the way to go. So there is no consideration for women's reproductive burden in the workplace in a context when they have to be spending more and more time at work. That results in women being in a profoundly inferior position and moving into more and more inferior positions in the workplace, or having to negotiate on an individual sort of personal level accommodation for reproductive burden in the workplace. So therefore, it's likely that workplace inequalities are also going to increase. So while women are doing more work at home, they're also experiencing a more unequal and not particularly accommodating environment in the workplace. So for all of those reasons, gender inequalities actually have been increasing and are likely to increase. And it's also important to note, and a lot of people have written about this, so this is not particularly new, but we should just note that, I should give you an example, which is not in the book because it just happened recently. A really good demonstration of the government approach to this is our Prime Minister's most recent article in one of his Samizdat letters, in which he said that some women are able to deal with workplace pressures and some are not so well, and this is really hard work, and he really admires women. This is the line that the government is following. They're sentimentalizing women's work. They're claiming that women are doing heroic work instead of actually paying them. So the point I'm trying to make is that that the government is building social policies in a way that that is bound to result in more gender inequality. In other words, in some sense, they're building this political regime on the backs of women, on the increasing workload on women's shoulders. That is the main story.
And how? Thank you. And how are these developments connected to political change in Hungary? I mean, there's no agreement on how to label it. Some talk about de-democratization, others about illiberalism. Some say we are beyond that. They see autocratization going on. However you want to call it. And these are actually important conceptual debates, but we don't get into them now. How are these changes related to what you call the anti-gender discourse, or what Conny and Andrea in their book call the war on gender? I mean, that's scary. A war on gender. How is the war on gender? How are increasing gender inequalities in Hungary? How are they connected to political developments in the region and beyond?
Yes, thank you for that question, Matthijs. So yeah, we use the word war on gender. It's not ours, right? It's a concept that has been labeled like this in the broader debate and literature because it's a wider development, right? So the things that we are seeing, this opposition to gender equality, is part of a wider development, and it's this war on gender, so to say, is led by conservative, right-wing, and religious actors. And they are mobilizing against feminism, but more particularly against the concept of gender. So this is why it's called a war on gender. They don't like the concept of gender. They don't like the idea that the idea of promoted in gender studies, that it's a social construct, right? And so instead they stress a kind of biological essentialism, saying that men and women are naturally different, or God creates them differently. And they say, well, gender then is an ideology. It's not a theoretical or scientific concept. It's an ideology which goes against traditional values and religious beliefs. So it's a dangerous concept, right? And this whole opposition to gender is not new, right? It's not entirely new. It started already back in the 1990s at the international level. So, and it had to do with the international developments, both the concept of gender, but also how this was taken up in international politics, in international frameworks. So since the mid-1990s, we see opposition, and the main protagonist here has been the Vatican. It's really a core player in this war on gender, because they have been really getting together a lot of different actors, connecting them, religious, conservative, right-wing actors, to a transnational network, right? And that network has also taken root in Central Eastern Europe, but also we see, you know, it's popping up in Africa, Latin America. The origin was quite strongly in North America, but it had also connections with Russia and so on. So it's a broad movement, a transnational movement, and it opposes all kinds of policy and demands which have to do with gender issues. So sexual education, that's a core issue, sexual and reproductive rights. But interesting then also the Istanbul Convention, and Andrea just explained why, right? Because it has this gender transformative component in it. And so these anti-gender actors are quite active in the region, but it's interesting to see, and this is why it's interesting that it's a comparative study, that they are different in all the 4 countries, right? It's not the same actors that take actually the lead and that initiated all this opposition to the Istanbul Convention. So the earliest rise of opposition to the Istanbul Convention we see was really in Poland, and it had to do quite strongly with the Roman Catholic Church, which had quite a strong, powerful position there since the transition. So they took the main lead there, but they were supported also by civil society actors, of course, recently very strongly with the political party, but also interesting, powerful think tanks. Ordo Iuris is a very important player here. It's a quite new think tank in Poland that is also transnationally active. In Hungary, by contract, it was mainly the government, and it's still mainly the government that opposed the Istanbul Convention. So supported by some government-led NGOs, but for instance, there's much less prominence of religious actors in Hungary. In Croatia, it is quite strongly Roman Catholic activist, but not so much the institutional, the church itself, but mainly Roman Catholic activists that come from the diaspora, so from other that migrated to other countries during the war and that are really pushing this movement in Croatia. And then finally in Bulgaria, 4th country, it started by civil society, religious civil society organizations, but then really the churches, particularly the Orthodox Church, took a leading role, but also Muslim organizations and Protestant Baptist churches and so on. They also opposed the Istanbul Convention, and then political parties stepped in as well. So it's interesting to see that there's different actors, but they all really oppose these transformative aspects of the convention, calling it a Trojan horse, right? Saying that the convention actually imports foreign elements, so they see it as something that doesn't belong to the region, that comes from outside, and so it imports foreign left-wing ideology into societies under this guise of an international convention on violence against women, right? So the convention is therefore a Trojan horse, and this is also why this whole opposition to the Istanbul Convention is part of a much wider developments.
So I think one of the reasons why our books go well together, not only because they're both about gender, but because mine is also sort of about this anti-gender thingy, but less about discourse. So my book is not about the discourse against gender, but the political talk about that addresses the gender lobby and gender ideology and the gender whatever's out there in Brussels, but more about the policies that result from this specific type of sort of approach to the relationship between men and women. Basically, you know, the argument in my book is that the government has a specific set of policies that changes gender relations, and is creating more gender inequality. And there are a number of ways in which these policies themselves, and of course talk about these policies. So to that extent, it's about discourse, but the actual policies themselves are used to strengthen anti-democratic rule. And this is where the relationship is between the shape of a political rule and gender policies. So the Hungarian government, for example, has been using its pro-natalist measures to claim a political legitimacy, to distinguish its rule from the rule of others, to show that the Hungary's political regime is better than, say, other political regimes, is more more Christian, better, more equal, more is the savior of Europe. So these measures are used to claim and to assert political legitimacy. They're also used to exclude some people from social citizenship rights and from therefore participation in the social and the public sphere, because the policies target a certain group of people, middle class, better off men and women who live in heterosexual marriages, and excludes others. So in that sense too, these policies that address gender relations in anti-liberal Hungary strengthen anti-liberal rule itself, not only contribute to gender inequality, but also strengthen the political rule, this particular type of political rule. And finally, the fact that the government has been that instead of that the government has been spending a lot of using established churches to do a lot of care work, or passing on care work responsibilities to churches that otherwise would be the state's responsibility to provide to churches. Through that process, a great deal of political loyalty is created. This is another way through which the government is, on the one hand, impacting gender relations by inserting itself, by participating in the division of care work, and at the same time strengthening anti-liberal political rule. So the argument in my book is that the gender inequality and the way it's regulated in Hungary is a mechanism that contributes to anti-liberalism and sort of the destabilization of democracy.
Okay, so these two bad tendencies are reinforcing each other. Now, both books are, I'm sorry to say, quite pessimistic. Probably Andrea and Conny's less so, because they have multiple cases, and in some cases it's worse than in others. So there's also, it's a mixed picture. But Eva, your book is downright depressing. Which leads us to the question, what is the outlook and what can be done? Maybe Eva, starting with you.
Bleak. Nothing. I'm a so profoundly pessimistic person. No, I'm joking. I actually do think that the outlook is bleak. I don't see much of a way out of here. So my book is very pessimistic. It does not show any solution. I have no idea what to do about this, other than overturn the government and reintroduce and create new policies. Because the direction at which, so this thing is getting worse and worse as we speak. So it's not, so clearly the direction is towards more inequalities and an ignorance of any measure, a rejection of any measure that would ameliorate those inequalities. The further creation of inequalities among women too. So the division and conquer strategy of creating some women who are benefiting from the system and others who don't. The construction of sort of really a single path through which state provisions can be claimed. Sort of a one ideal life form that everybody has to comply with. I just don't see, this is the direction in which the government policies are going, and they're just accelerating and reaching heights that I never would have expected are possible. So I don't think that this government would ever turn back and move in the other direction, no matter how many otherwise photogenic ministers, state secretaries it has. Because I have to give it to them, this is the one government that actually has possibly one of the highest number of female ministers in office. That's not quite true, because the Medgyessy government actually had also three women at one point in time, but that was maybe about 3 months. So in that regard, this government seems to be doing well, but in just about every other, I'm terribly pessimistic.
I can already imagine the headlines tomorrow in the government-friendly press. CU congratulates Orban's progressive choice of ministers. Andrea, Conny.
we divide up. I say the pessimistic part, and Conny says the optimistic part. Okay. What we find is that this has serious consequences for democracy, basically, we could talk a lot about this, but let me just pull out like 3 main elements from this. So in terms of violence, I mean, we have to see that there is more violence. There's different forms of violence. There's more violence. So whereas we look at policies and we see how the letter of the law progresses, despite the fact that there is all this backlash against the convention. But if you look at what happens to those laws in practice, that's where we see some really disturbing practices, not only in Orbán's Hungary, but also in the more in the less de-democratizing Croatia, or also, so in all 4 countries, we see some tendencies that are really worrisome. There is, we could say that the states are not exercising the due diligence of protection. So they are the way in which protection decreases is by very poor implementation. So now numbers in budgets increase. A lot of money comes from the European Union, for instance, for protection against violence. But what happens to that money that enters the channel of problematic distribution that we all know so well about Hungary? But that's a lot the case also in Poland and in Croatia, where funds are not going to those who were the main protagonists of protection from violence against women. That is mainly women's organizations, but they go to different kinds of cronies of the regimes. So the violence against women now becomes a lucrative business in a way for relatives, friends, and you name them. And you see very clearly the tendency to marginalize women's rights organizations from these processes of implementation, which on the one hand is a problem because of a voice issue, but it is also a problem because these are the organizations who have the expertise in intervening in these fields. They develop the protocols, the guidelines, the ways so this knowledge is not taken over, but new actors come in. A lot of these are conservative actors and take over implementation in rather problematic ways. So that's in terms of implementation. But you also see direct violence coming from some states. You see direct violence against advocates of women's rights. So you see that clearly in Hungary and also in Poland. You see smear campaigns, you see auditing, you see all kinds of very problematic processes against the very actors who are supposed to protect women from violence or help women who are victims of violence. So that's one part. But you also see another consequence, which is very troublesome, and again, it's very evenly visible in all 4 countries. Is the exclusion of women's rights advocates from policy processes. And this comes very much along the lines of the reconfiguring civic space, in which new, more conservative organizations come to replace altogether or just come along with women's rights organizations. So in less dramatically de-democratizing countries like Croatia, what you see is that when a policy proposal is discussed on gender equality related issues, now it is not anymore women's organizations and human rights organizations who sit around the table, but half of that table is taken over by all sorts of conservative and anti-feminist organizations who tend to block the initiatives. And the process is more sad in Hungary and Poland, where these organizations are blocked from any kind of consultation. They are blocked from providing any sort of training, advice, consultation to those who participate in implementation. So basically, they are on a blacklist in these 2 countries. So these are very, very troublesome processes, and they also impact on how violence against women policies are implemented, but they also impact on voice issue and representation for for those who can speak for women's rights organizations. So you have that issue. And then there is the bigger issue, of course, of what these very strongly politicized debates about gender equality tell about women in society, women as a group in society. So that's a more collectivist problem around democracy, on how you, by problematizing these laws and problematize, or the convention and gender equality more generally, you send the message of how women are secondary citizens, basically in the country, not deserving protection. So that's a really problematic part. So this is in wide brushes, and maybe you tell a little bit about optimism. What's our optimism?
Some optimism, yeah. Well, we actually started the book because of we initially, when we were observing this, quite optimistic or positive, in the sense like what Andrea already told before, like, oh, finally they're talking about violence against women, right? Before, all these policy debates basically were about family violence, and they didn't talk about women as victims, mostly about children as victims. So we really like, okay, so these debates and this opposition actually now has changed something, because we are talking gender issues. We're talking about that this is a problem that has to do with women, particularly, that women are much more affected by violence, and that this has something to do with gender relations, right? So yeah, we started from that optimism, but of course, digging deeper into the whole process, we saw so many of these very difficult things, like Andrea just mentioned, that we gradually became much more pessimistic. But yeah, in the end, I think there's mixed, right? It's mixed. I think overall, yes, pessimistic, but there's also some positive policy development. So we don't see a complete stalling of policy. So in some countries, we've seen new policies developing, which is a positive sign. More budget, although, yeah, as Andrea just told, this budget is quite strongly corrupted. So that's a bit problematic, and women's organizations are pushed out of the process. So again, pessimism, but okay, overall the policy is not stalled. So that's a good sign. And also, yeah, in some countries, I mean, the Istanbul Convention got blocked, but in other countries, actually, despite all the opposition, like in Croatia, it was ratified, right? And that was really the result of a lot of also resistance to these anti-gender movements and these conservative actors. So we really see that there is a strong reinvigoration, we would say, in some countries, right? Not in all countries, of feminist actors, of women's movements, activism. I mean, we've clearly seen this in Poland, right? This was all over the news, how Polish women actually stood up against all this conservative backlash. And it's much less visible in Hungary, unfortunately, where the movement is really experiencing a lot of difficulties because of all this violence. But in Croatia, we've also seen quite a strong, vibrant women's movement opposing all this anti-gender opposition, and been successfully, right? So that's a very sign of optimism, and also that they managed to create broader coalitions. So also beyond women's rights activism, with other pro-democracy actors. So I think it's overall also a positive sign that now gender issues are taken up by pro-democracy actors as part of democracy, right? That democracy should also be about equal rights, and that gender equality is part of a democracy agenda, that we cannot have democracy if we have unequal gender relations or unequal societies. So that's I think that's what we conclude is quite a positive sign that there are now broader coalitions that support the women's agenda, particularly also the IC. So it's interesting to see that some politicians that never ever have mobilized before and never ever defended women's rights or spoke about violence against women have actually taken up the issue and defended the agenda, right? So Croatia is an interesting example. Maybe it was most and Tusk as well, that maybe their motivation was pro-Europe, but in the end, of course, they also ended up defending and pushing the Istanbul Convention. And so yeah, I think overall that is still a positive thing, right? That actors that cannot support this agenda before have been active on the issue. So sum up.
Yeah.
Matthijs, sorry
yes.
to cut in, but we actually have an audience of about, I don't know, 25 people, so which you can't see. But maybe I should ask them if they want to ask a question. Or
absolutely,
no?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the floor is open if anybody has a question. If not, then I'm sure we could continue for the next 10 minutes. But Balázs has a question. Hold on. You need a mic. And I can give you mine, or why don't I give you mine? I'll give you mine.
So thank you for this fascinating discussion. I was wondering about mechanisms, how gender oppression is a tool for illiberalism. It's a bit puzzling for me. I was just talking with Andreas. Why don't they just embrace and support women? That's half of their voting base. Why are they ostracizing and suppressing half of the voter base? I guess Fidesz is not overwhelmingly male, voted for by males. So it's still puzzling for me. I get some of the mechanisms that you said, but I would like to probe this a bit more.
Shall I respond? And then it's your turn. Or maybe we should ask if there are any more questions, but I'm going to forget this. And this is the question that Zsolt asked me the last time I talked about this paper or this book. And one answer to that is that they're not ostracizing women. They're utilizing women's labor power in every which way. Their reproductive labor power and their paid labor power. And simultaneously, they're creating a smaller group of very loyal women and men through the people who are benefiting from a family family protection measures. And sort of the rest are left by the wayside. But that smaller group, or the group that is being promoted, is extremely loyal politically. Those are lower middle class to middle class women who actually end up with a windfall through or women with children, heterosexual couple, etc. So that is a group of women who are definitely benefiting from this. I think that is politically. I'm fairly sure that is politically beneficial, and either way, the argument is of course also about gender, an increase in gender inequality, but also, and perhaps more importantly, an increase in the exploitation of women's labor, which amount of work goes directly towards both economic and political goals of the regime.
Yeah, maybe I add a little bit to this one. Yeah, I totally agree that they are not ostracizing women, but they just want to see certain kinds of women. So women have to fit. I think Eva very nicely put it somewhat earlier that it's not doing away with women altogether, but just keeping them in their place. That's the point. So not transforming, and that's one thing. The other agenda, I think, with the gender issue, which we didn't have enough time to go into that, but it's also the drawing more clearly the line between women and for instance, LGBT organizations. So I think, and anybody who has a more fluid understanding of gender or a more social constructivist understanding of gender. So it's okay to protect women as long as they behave the way we want them to behave. So that's the narrative, and the point when you start questioning that and you ask about power and about equality, then you're stepping out from the narrative. So that's not ostracizing women, but just keeping the social organization as it was. That's basically the aim, I think, here. And the division between and the very tricky division that comes with this gender issue, saying, oh yes to women but no to gender, that is basically putting also women's organizations in very difficult positions in thinking about, okay, so do we cooperate with all these? So that is it worse for us to cooperate with these other organizations like LGBT organizations, or is it better if we just stay to little very essentializing understanding of what's womanhood. So there is that tension, and that's happening in all of these countries in the debate. So that's very, very important, I think.
I should add too, and maybe this is what András wants to ask, that the relationship between anti-liberalism and an increase in gender inequality is not deterministic. So it's not a necessary component of an anti-liberal regime, because there's quite a bit of variation in how various anti-liberal sort of leaning regimes or political parties approach the question of gender. So, for example, a lot of Latin American populist parties are in fact quite pro-gender or more pro-gender equality, have a rather different approach. My book is about Hungary and mostly analyzing the actual concrete relationships between the construction of the further exploitation and the exacerbation of women's exploitation and its connection to anti-liberal rule here. But I don't think that that's necessarily has to be just the same connection. I just wanted to add to that. And in fact, I thought that was really interesting in Andreas Conny's book, that there's a comparison, which is really this sort of screams for the need for comparison. Sorry, András, but you need.
Yes, thank you very much. I haven't read the book, so I cannot comment, but I wish to comment the discussion, which I found very interesting. So maybe my comment is, I just want to offer a possible explanation why authoritarian regimes dislike genders. Maybe they dislike social constructions. They prefer biological constructions because they prefer binary oppositions. They prefer simple explanations, simplified explanations about life, because this is what can be sold to their voters. They offer easy answers that, black and white, men and women, biologically determined, and this is how life is. So, no different colors between these two. So maybe just the same like they don't like those Jewish people who are not Orthodox. So they give a lot of money to the Orthodox community. In the meantime, they don't like the Majihis, which is more sort of civilian Jewish community. So in between is not good. So they like a simple explanation and binary opposition based on biology and something which is given already by God or something, by nature. And because if you accept any in between positions, then it is open to interpretation. And if you are interpreting, then you are open up different explanations, and you are just one step to criticism. And they dislike critical thinking, so they try to simplify. That is and maybe that is why they hate gender beyond women and men and so on.
Can I say something? Because I think yes, but I think this goes more for right-wing authoritarian regimes and not so much left-wing. So I think again the example of Latin America that Eva just brought up shows that, I mean, if you would look at Venezuela or Nicaragua at the moment, they embrace a gender concept and ideology, but they twist it in a different way. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of variation there, and we really need to look good into these cases to understand the connections, right? I think it's a little bit more complex, actually.
Yeah. I also have one comment to András, actually. I see your point. And in a way, you are right, but I think we have to be very clear of why these exact relations are picked. So why it is women and men where they like this duality, why it is Jews and non-Jews where they want to see this separation. So these are specific inequality relations within our societies that they like to maintain. So it's not those who have glasses and no glasses, but they pick their groups and their divisions or their poles according to existing inequalities and reinforcing those existing inequalities. So I think that's very important to add to the logic that you are saying, that not just any poles are okay, but the ones that we like to keep in place. Those are the ones that we want to.
Okay, looking at the clock, I see that it's 1 already. Time does fly. So let's wrap up by encouraging everybody in the audience, online and in Budapest, to buy the book and read it. And then we can continue this discussion, hopefully at some other time, maybe another event organized by the Democracy Institute. Thanks very much to the participants, especially Eva, Andrea, Conny, for talking about your book. I learned a lot, and I genuinely look forward to reading your book in more depth.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.